Mourners and protesters are marking 40 days since 22-year-old Mahsa Amini died while in the custody of Iran's morality police. And despite deadly government crackdowns, demonstrations against the regime are still going strong across the country. But how likely are they to spark real change? Data coming out of Harvard finds the odds are not in their favor. As the lead researcher put it, nonviolent campaigns are seeing the lowest success rates in more than a century, with around 1 in 6 protests leading to some sort of systemic change over the last few years, compared to 2 in 3 finding success in the early 2000s. The researcher went on to say, for the first time since the 40s, a decade dominated by state-backed partisan rebellions against Nazi occupations, nonviolent resistance does not have a statistically significant advantage over armed insurrection. So does soup throwing stand a better chance? What kind of protest is likely to lead to real change and what is not? Could some of that power lie in the arts? I'm joined by Stephen Duncombe. He's a professor and co-founder and research director for the Center for Artistic Activism at NYU. We had intended to have Black Lives Matter activist DeRay McKesson, who co-founded Campaign Zero, with us. Unfortunately, he was unable to join at the very last moment. Stephen, good to meet you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
Pretty provocative headline in The Guardian in a piece you wrote. The soup protesters, and I assume people know those were those who threw tomato soup at the Van Gogh at the National Gallery and then glued themselves to the wall. The soup protesters grabbed the world's attention, but were they effective? How did you answer the question? Were they effective?
Well, it's too soon to know. But my real question is, what was their objective? When we work with activists, the key thing we work with is, okay, well, we have a goal, right? And this clearly just stop oil. But what is the objective of the action? What was actually trying to be done by the action? What do you want people to do? And who is your audience? And what do you want that audience to think, feel, and do? I mean, here we are, 2 weeks later, and we're still talking about the action. And we're not talking about the fact that unless we get rid of carbon-based fuels, we're going to exterminate human life on this planet. And I think that is problematic when you talk about the action and not actually what the objective of the action might be or the goal of the action.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you, unless, and I have no idea if they do, if they have a longer term plan. If sort of step one was to crack people's minds open, and then maybe next step. The only analogy I can think of is most people I talk to were appalled by this soup throwing. And by the way, it should be clear, I think there's plexiglass or something in front. I'm not defending it, but it wasn't on the Van Gogh itself. And I sort of analogize it to how I remember people responding to PETA maybe a decade or so ago. It's outrageous. They're throwing red paint on women in expensive furs. All we're talking about is the red paint. Well, it took a while, but down the line, a lot of communities said no to fur. My hometown of Cambridge is just voting on it this week or last or something like that. So if it's part of a continuum of action, maybe the fact that we only know about the soup now is not such a horrible thing, no?
Perhaps. I mean, and we will see. And if it's not part of a larger campaign, then it really won't be effective. And that's true for any sort of activist intervention. But I think what PETA had going for it, and I'm not the biggest fan of PETA's actions, I'll put that out there, but what PETA had going for it was that there's a direct connection between the action and the message.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Which was, you are wearing a fur. A fur is taken from an animal who bleeds, right? The connection between throwing tomato soup at a Van Gogh painting of a sunflower to protest oil is so convoluted that the legibility factor, which is absolutely essential in any sort of activist action, you want your audience to know what you're about, and you want them to know what they can do to act upon it. That gets lost.
I think convoluted is being kind, actually, frankly, but I think you were being kind. So what does make a successful protest? And are there common threads through all of them, actually, whether they're, again, millions of people on the street for Black Lives Matter after Michael Brown was killed, beginning, and then obviously after George Floyd, to small demonstrations about other things that matter. Is there a common thread?
Yeah, I think so. My go-to examples are always from the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, because they were actually really brilliant at thinking tactics. Let's just take a very famous one, Rosa Parks refusing to get up her seat on a bus in Montgomery in 1955. Now, what was so brilliant about that is the action itself communicated what the message was,
Exactly.
which is the right of African Americans to sit wherever they want on a bus. So that's number one. Number two, it was part of a larger campaign. It was kicking off the campaign, but it was a fully worked out campaign that included other civil rights leaders, the Black churches, and had a method towards desegregation, which was going to be the bus boycott. They thought about their audiences, both African Americans in Montgomery, which they wanted to get to join the bus boycott. They also thought about a wider American audience, which might not care about the policies of white supremacy. And very importantly, they thought about U.S. being in competition with the Soviet Union at that time on a worldwide stage over who was going to bear the mantle of peace and justice. And those images played into all of that.
But there are a lot of successful efforts that are not nearly as well thought out, nor as impactful. I mean, just this week, Adidas dropped Kanye West, and he went from a billionaire down to a mere, whatever it is, $400 million. Adidas didn't do it purely because they're a socially responsible corporation. They took a huge amount of crap. So what common thread that you see in successful protests was there that led to that outcome?
Well, I mean, you know, what they had a fear of is a boycott, okay? And so boycotting can be a very, very successful tactic. I think of United Farm Workers in the 1970s. You know, my parents wouldn't buy grapes, they wouldn't buy lettuce. And it was brilliant because it took this abstraction of a labor struggle across all these fields in California and brought it to a centralized place. And very importantly, gave people something to do. My parents could support the farm workers way out in California by not buying lettuce and not buying grapes.
By the way, I had Dolores Huerta here not too long ago, and it's so thrilling. It is unbelievable. Are you surprised that there was not, I mean, the women's marches after the day after the inauguration of Trump were huge, absolutely huge. I have to say, I was stunned by the fact that there was not a national upheaval of women and men after the Dobbs decision repealing Roe. Were you surprised? And why do you think there was that I mean, there were demonstrations outside the Supreme Court and isolated demonstrations around the country, but nothing huge. Why?
Well, I think this goes back to explaining a little bit about the actions of the Just Stop Oil activists, is that one of the problems, the sort of tried and true, you know, methods of the march, the rally, the petition, is they've been done so much they've become routinized. They become every day. And therefore, when they come every day, they don't have that capacity to make us stop and think and reevaluate. And so I applaud this idea of thinking about creative new ways of actions. I mean, that's what we do at the Center for Artistic Activism. We get people to try to create like artists when they go into their activism as a way to offer surprise and shake people up and make it so they can't just dismiss it as, oh, that's just another march. That's just another rally. So I think that explains a little bit of that sort of the shock value that those protesters that threw the tomato soup. The problem is even as you're striving to be new, you do have to think about old things like, what's your objective? Who's your audience? Is this going to resonate with them and pass your message through? So, but I think that, you know, the old models have to constantly be recreated.
Indeed. Do you know if they're still glued to the wall, Stephen, or do you not know?
No, I imagine they got them out.
Stephen Duncombe, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.